She was building her cabin alone, until a lonely cowboy offered his heart. She stood on the empty land early one morning holding a folded paper with rough measurements drawn in pencil. The air was cold, quiet, and clean in a way she had never known in the city. There were no car horns, no crowded sidewalks, no voices pushing into her thoughts, just wind moving through tall grass and the distant sound of birds waking up. This place was far from everything she had once called normal, and that was exactly why she chose it. Her decision to leave her old life had not been sudden. It had grown slowly, like a crack that spreads through glass. For years she had lived surrounded by people, yet felt unseen. Relationships had disappointed her. Promises had been made and broken. Trust, once given easily, had become something she guarded closely. When the last thing she depended on fell apart, she realized she could not keep pretending that her life was fine. The idea of building a cabin alone came to her during one sleepless night. At first, it felt unrealistic, even foolish. She had no background in construction and very little savings, but the thought stayed with her. A small place of her own. Simple, honest, built with her own hands. The more she thought about it, the more it felt like the only way forward. Selling most of her belongings was harder than she expected. Each item carried a memory, even the ones she rarely used. She kept only what was necessary: clothes, tools, books, and a few personal things that reminded her who she was before life became heavy. When she drove away from the city, she did not look back. The land she bought was not perfect, but it was rough, uneven, and surrounded by wide open space. Some people would have seen it as lonely or inconvenient. She saw freedom. There were no neighbors close enough to watch her. No noise except what nature created. She liked that. It made her feel small in a good way, as if the world was bigger than her pain. Her days quickly settled into a routine. She woke up with the sun, cooked simple meals, and spent hours learning how to measure, cut, and plan. Every mistake taught her something. Sometimes she got frustrated and had to step away, breathing deeply until the tight feeling in her chest loosened. Other times, she surprised herself with how capable she could be when she didn't give up. The physical work was exhausting. Her hands blistered and her muscles ached in places she never knew existed. At night, she lay on a thin mattress in a temporary shelter she had set up, staring at the ceiling while her body pulsed with tiredness. Yet she slept better than she had in years. The quiet helped. So did the feeling that each day she was moving forward, even if slowly. People in the nearby town noticed her. A woman building alone was not something they saw often. Some were curious, others doubtful. A few offered quick comments or advice when she passed through to buy supplies. She nodded politely but kept conversation short. She was not rude, just careful. She had learned that letting people too close too quickly often led to disappointment. There were moments when doubt crept in. On days when the weather turned harsh or when something went wrong with the plans, she questioned herself. She wondered if she had taken on too much, if leaving everything behind had been a mistake. During those moments, she reminded herself why she came. She did not come to prove anything to anyone else. She came to breathe again. One afternoon, while marking the ground where the foundation would go, she paused and looked around. The land stretched out endlessly, the sky wide and open. For the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet sense of pride. Nothing about this was easy, but it was real. Every step she took here was her own choice. She thought often about her past, though she tried not to dwell on it. Memories came without warning, conversations that ended badly, moments where she stayed silent when she should have spoken, trust she gave when she should have waited. Instead of pushing those thoughts away, she let them pass through her. She told herself that this place was not about escaping who she was, but about becoming someone stronger. The cabin, in her mind, was more than wood and nails. It was a promise that she could stand on her own, that she could create something lasting without depending on anyone else, that she could rebuild not just a home, but herself. As days turned into weeks, her progress became visible. Wooden frames stood where there had once been nothing. The shape of the cabin began to emerge, simple but sturdy. She stepped back often to look at it, imagining what it would feel like when it was finished. Warm, safe, hers. Even in moments of exhaustion, she refused to rush. She wanted it done right, not fast. This was not a project to be checked off a list. It was a journey, one she needed to take slowly, learning patience along the way. At night, the loneliness sometimes felt heavier. The silence that comforted her during the day could feel overwhelming after dark. She missed conversation, laughter, and the sound of another person moving nearby, but she reminded herself that loneliness was not the same as emptiness. She was not empty anymore. She was healing. She wrote in a small notebook every evening. Nothing fancy, just thoughts, observations, and lessons learned that day. Some entries were short. Others spilled onto the page as if she had been holding them back for years. Writing helped her understand herself better. It made the quiet less intimidating. She did not know what the future would bring. She did not expect answers or miracles. All she wanted was peace and the chance to live honestly. If that meant doing it alone, she believed she could handle it. Standing there one evening, watching the sun sink behind the hills, she placed her hand on one of the wooden beams. It felt solid beneath her fingers. She smiled softly, not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time in a long time, she trusted herself. She didn't realize it yet, but her life was already beginning to change, not because of anyone else, but because she had chosen herself. And that choice would soon open the door to something she never expected. But for now, her story was about one woman, a piece of land, and the quiet strength it took to start over. Days passed, and the woman's cabin slowly began to take shape. Every morning she woke up before the sun and worked until the sky turned orange with sunset. She had started to feel a rhythm in the hard work, cutting the wood, hammering nails, measuring carefully. Each action became familiar, almost comforting. She had learned that building something with her hands was different from anything else in life. It required patience, precision, and focus. Mistakes were costly, but they also taught her lessons she would not forget. It was during one of these long days that she first noticed him. From the distance, she saw a figure on horseback, riding along the ridge near her land. He was a cowboy, tall and lean, wearing a hat that shadowed his eyes. He stopped when he reached the edge of his property, looking toward her cabin. There was something quiet and cautious about the way he watched, as if he didn't want to intrude, but he was curious. She returned his gaze briefly and then turned back to her work. She didn't know his name, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. The first encounter happened when she needed help moving a large beam. She had struggled for hours trying to lift it by herself, but it was heavy and awkward. Just as she adjusted her grip again, a voice called out, "You're going to hurt yourself doing that alone." She turned and saw the cowboy standing a few feet away. He nodded politely, holding the reins of his horse. "Need a hand?" At first, she hesitated. She had made this journey to be independent, to do everything by herself, but the beam was heavy and her arms were tired. After a moment, she nodded, and he stepped forward. Together they lifted it into place. His movements were careful, measured, and steady. She noticed that he worked slowly but efficiently, without showing off, without unnecessary words. When it was done, he tipped his hat and said, "There, that's better." After that day, he returned occasionally. Sometimes he helped with small tasks, carrying supplies, holding boards, fixing mistakes she had made. Other times he simply rode by and waved, staying at the edge of her land. They didn't talk much at first. Words were not necessary. The quiet presence of someone else, without pressure or expectation, was enough to feel strange but comforting. She noticed details about him. The way his hands were rough but skilled, the calm patience in his eyes, the slight smile he gave when she managed a task alone. She wondered about him sometimes. Who was he? Did he always live in these hills? Was he lonely too? She didn't ask. She was learning to be careful with her curiosity, not wanting to invite disappointment. The weather turned harsher one week. A storm came through the hills with wind so strong it rattled the temporary roof she had built over the cabin's frame. Rain fell in sheets, soaking the ground and making it impossible to continue construction. She worked quickly to secure what she could, but by the end of the day, everything was wet and unstable. Sitting on a log, exhausted and shivering, she realized that she might need help to survive this storm. It was then that he appeared. She had not expected him. He rode slowly toward her, his horse slipping slightly in the mud. "You okay?" he called over the roar of the wind. She nodded, too tired to speak. Without asking, he dismounted and helped her move supplies under cover. He worked steadily, silently, as the rain poured down. Watching him, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had never admitted to herself that she needed help sometimes, but now she could not deny it. That night, after the storm passed, he stayed nearby. They sat by a small fire she had managed to light under a makeshift shelter. The sky was clear again, filled with stars, and the air smelled fresh and clean. For the first time in a long while, she talked about herself, not her work, but her life. She told him about leaving the city, about the loneliness that had followed her, about the desire to build something real with her own hands. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. In return, he shared parts of his story, too. He had once had a family, he said, and had lost them through circumstances he didn't explain fully. He had stayed on this land for years, keeping to himself. He knew what it was to be lonely, and he understood why she wanted her space. Yet he also seemed to suggest gently that solitude did not have to mean isolation. Days turned into weeks, and the woman began to notice that she looked forward to seeing him. She told herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. She reminded herself that she had come to this land to be independent, to learn to rely on herself. Yet, every time he appeared, she felt a warmth she could not name. The way he offered help without demanding anything in return was foreign to her. It made her heart beat a little faster, though she refused to admit it even to herself. They began to work together more often, not every day, but enough that a rhythm developed. He would bring supplies, she would manage the plans, and together they would lift, measure, and secure. Sometimes, when she made a mistake, he would gently correct her. Sometimes, when he misjudged a measurement, she would smile and point it out. Laughter began to creep into their work, soft at first, then more frequent. She realized that even though she had intended to do everything alone, having someone who respected her independence while offering support felt good. She noticed small gestures that touched her more than she expected. He would leave extra firewood stacked neatly near her shelter. He would check on the cabin when she was away in town. Occasionally, he would bring small gifts: an apple, a loaf of bread, a simple tool she hadn't realized she needed. Each time she felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion. She wasn't used to people showing kindness without strings attached. Despite the growing connection, fear lingered, a high feeling. She had been hurt before. Trust was fragile. Part of her wanted to pull away, to keep him at a distance, to remind herself that she could do this alone. She had promised herself that no one would ever control her life again. Yet another part of her wanted to lean in, to accept his help, to see what it might feel like to share her life, even a small piece of it, with someone else. One morning, while they worked on the roof beams, he paused and looked at her. "You're stronger than I thought," he said simply. There was no teasing, no judgment, just an acknowledgement of her effort. She felt her cheeks warm. She wanted to reply, to say something witty or clever, but words stuck in her throat. She realized she had not felt seen like this in a long time. Not by anyone. The seasons began to shift. Summer turned to early autumn, and the air carried a crispness that made work harder but more invigorating. The woman learned to anticipate weather patterns, to protect her materials, and to move efficiently. The cowboy continued to help, but he also let her take the lead, letting her make decisions about every detail of the cabin. Slowly, she began to trust not just his skill, but his judgment and his presence. There were small moments that caught her off guard: a smile when he handed her a hammer, a glance that lasted a little too long, a quiet laugh shared over a mistake that could have ruined a beam. She told herself these were fleeting feelings, nothing more. Yet deep down she knew that the cabin was not the only thing being built. Something more fragile, more meaningful was forming between them. One afternoon, a setback threatened to undo their progress. A strong wind tore part of the roof she had been working on. She felt panic rise in her chest. The cowboy appeared almost immediately, helping her assess the damage, moving beams carefully, and calming her frantic thoughts. Working together, they managed to repair the worst of it before the sun went down. That night, sitting quietly near a small fire, she realized how much she had come to rely on him, not just for help, but for companionship. She began to notice herself laughing more easily, feeling lighter even after long days of labor. The solitude she had once craved still mattered, but she had begun to see that life did not have to be completely alone to be meaningful. There was room for others, for connection, for warmth. She had started to open a small corner of her heart to the possibility of someone else sharing her world. As the weeks turned into months, their partnership grew in ways she had not expected. She was still independent, still determined to finish her cabin with her own hands, but she had learned that accepting help did not diminish her strength. It enhanced it. The presence of another human being, patient and kind, made the work less tiring and the victories sweeter. By the time the first frost arrived, the skeleton of the cabin was nearly complete. Standing together, surveying the work, she felt a pride unlike anything she had known. This was her creation, built through determination and grit. Yet it was also a joint effort, quiet and understated, that had brought her closer to another human soul than she had been in years. She realized that while she had come to the hills seeking solitude, she had found something else: connection, trust, and a small, fragile beginning of love. And she knew, even if she didn't fully admit it yet, that this cowboy, this quiet, patient, kind-hearted man, was no longer just a neighbor. He had become part of her story, part of the cabin, and perhaps part of the life she was slowly learning to embrace. The air had grown colder as autumn deepened, painting the hills in shades of gold and red. The woman had become stronger, more confident in her work, and she could see the cabin slowly rising from the ground as a real, solid structure. Yet, with every beam she secured and every board she nailed, she felt a subtle shift within herself. The solitude that had once been comforting now sometimes felt heavy. She had grown used to the quiet, but now she found herself noticing the absence of human voices, of shared laughter, of companionship beyond the occasional help from the cowboy. One crisp morning, while she worked on the upper part of the cabin's frame, a slip of her foot made her stumble. She grabbed a beam just in time, but the strain in her shoulder reminded her of the limits of working alone. The cowboy appeared almost instantly, as if he had sensed her struggle from the distance. "Careful," he said softly, helping her steady herself. His hands were strong, steady, and reassuring, and for a moment, she realized she had stopped thinking of him as just a helper. He had become a presence she relied on, whether she admitted it or not. The incident sparked something new. She began to notice little ways he had become part of her daily life. He would bring extra firewood without being asked. He noticed when her tools were worn or dull and replaced them quietly. Sometimes he would ride alongside her as she collected materials, talking in soft tones about the land, the seasons, or the best ways to handle certain tasks. Each conversation was simple, but it brought warmth to her day that she had not anticipated. She told herself repeatedly that she did not need this, that independence meant facing life entirely on her own. Yet, her heart betrayed her. Their relationship began to grow slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the roots of a tree spreading beneath the soil before a single leaf appears. The cowboy had a calm patience that matched her stubbornness. He never forced his presence, never tried to take control. He simply offered support and understanding, letting her lead while gently guiding when necessary. She had learned to accept help without guilt, and in doing so, she began to trust him, not just with tasks, but with her thoughts and her quiet moments. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land, they took a break together. Sitting on a fallen log, she sipped her water while he watched the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. She looked at him, surprised by the compliment. She had spent months pouring her energy into the cabin, enduring exhaustion, cold, and frustration, yet hearing those words felt like more than praise. It felt like recognition, acknowledgement that her efforts mattered and that she was seen. In the weeks that followed, their interactions became more personal. She shared small stories from her past, pieces of herself she had never revealed to anyone. He listened without judgment, sometimes nodding, sometimes smiling gently, always giving her space to speak. In turn, he shared more of his life. He spoke of his family, of loss and loneliness, of years spent on the land learning to survive and thrive. He did not seek pity or sympathy. He simply offered honesty. It was the kind of openness she had longed for but never expected to find. Yet, despite the growing closeness, fear lingered. She had been hurt before, and trust was fragile. Part of her wanted to keep him at a distance, to protect herself from the possibility of pain. She reminded herself that she had come here to be independent, to live on her own terms. The idea of relying on someone, of letting someone into her life completely, terrified her. But another part of her, quieter, more insistent, wanted to lean in to see where this connection could lead. One particularly harsh morning, a storm rolled over the hills with sudden force. Rain fell in torrents and wind shook the wooden frame of the cabin. She fought to secure the roof boards, but the effort was exhausting, and a heavy gust knocked part of a plank loose. Panic rose in her chest. She realized she could not handle this alone. Almost as if on cue, he arrived, riding through the mud and rain without hesitation. Together they worked through the storm, steadying beams, moving boards, and securing the structure as best they could. By the time the rain eased, they were soaked, exhausted, and cold. But the cabin had survived. Sitting near a small fire they built to warm themselves, she felt a surge of gratitude and relief. She realized in that moment that she had come to depend on him in ways she had never admitted, not because she was weak, but because human connection had become as vital to her as the work she poured into the cabin. She began to see that independence did not mean isolation, and that trusting someone did not diminish her strength. Over the next few weeks, their bond deepened further. They laughed more easily, their conversations flowing with a natural ease. She began to anticipate his visits, finding comfort in his presence. He, too, seemed to relax around her, sharing small jokes, stories about the land, and moments of quiet reflection. Their connection was not dramatic or sudden. It was steady, growing like a river carving its path through rock, slowly but inevitably shaping the landscape of their lives. One afternoon, while adjusting a support beam on the cabin, she noticed him watching her with an intensity that made her pause. "You've learned fast," he said simply, a hint of pride in his voice. Her cheeks warmed, and for a moment, she forgot how to respond. There was something about the way he looked at her, honest, respectful, patient, that made her heart beat faster. She had spent so long shielding herself, keeping people at a distance, and yet here was someone who seemed genuinely interested in her well-being, without expectation or demand. Their days began to feel lighter, filled with a quiet joy they had both learned to appreciate. They shared meals by a small fire, collected wood together, and worked side by side, often without speaking, simply enjoying each other's presence. She realized that the cabin, once a symbol of her independence, had become a shared project. It represented not just her strength, but their partnership, however small or fragile it might be. Despite the growing warmth between them, she struggled with fear. She was still learning to trust, still wary of being hurt again. The thought of admitting her feelings, of risking vulnerability, was terrifying. Yet, she could not ignore the subtle changes in her heart. The anticipation of seeing him, the comfort in his quiet support, the joy of shared laughter. She found herself wondering what it might be like to let someone into her life fully, to allow herself to feel connection without fear. But one day as they worked on the final roof supports, he paused and looked at her with an expression that caught her off guard. "You're doing more than just building a cabin," he said quietly. "You're building a life. And I want to be part of it if you'll let me." The words struck her, and for a moment she could only stare. The fear she had carried for so long fought against the warmth of possibility. But deep down, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years: hope. She did not respond immediately, unsure how to put words to the mixture of emotions swirling inside her. But she felt a shift, subtle and undeniable. The walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack, not through force or pressure, but through the gentle persistence of someone who cared without asking for control. She realized that opening her heart did not mean giving up her independence. It meant allowing herself to grow in a way she could not achieve alone. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the cabin frame, she found herself smiling softly. She looked at the cowboy who had returned to his horse after helping her secure the last beam, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The cabin was nearly complete, but more importantly, A new chapter was beginning, one that involved trust, companionship, and the quiet possibility of love. By the time the first frost of late autumn arrived, the cabin stood tall and sturdy, a testament to months of effort, determination, and resilience. The woman looked at it with pride, knowing she had accomplished something remarkable. Yet, as she glanced at the cowboy standing nearby, she realized that the true achievement was not just the structure itself, but the bond they had formed along the way. They had weathered storms, worked side by side, and learned to trust one another, building not just a cabin, but a foundation for a life that neither had expected, but both quietly longed for. The days that followed were filled with small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary. They shared morning coffee by the cabin, collected wood for the stove, and worked together on finishing touches. Their connection deepened naturally, without rush or pressure, and she found herself slowly letting go of the fear that had once dominated her heart. She was learning that love did not have to be overwhelming or dangerous. It could be steady, quiet, and supportive. Like the hands that helped her lift beams, like the eyes that watched over her when storms raged, like the presence that had become a part of her daily life. And so, as autumn gave way to early winter, the woman realized that her journey was no longer just about building a cabin. It was about learning to trust, to accept help, and to allow herself to feel connection once more. The cowboy had become more than a neighbor or a helper. He had become a companion, a quiet strength beside her, and perhaps the beginning of a love that had been patiently waiting to grow. The first winter arrived quietly, with frost covering the hills and a thin layer of snow settling on the ground. The cabin, finally standing tall and strong, looked cozy against the stark, cold landscape. The woman had accomplished more than she had imagined, yet the long months of labor and solitude had left her cautious in ways she could not shake. She had grown attached to her independence, to the quiet rhythm of her own life, and now, with the cowboy so close, she felt an unfamiliar tension stirring inside her. It began in small, almost imperceptible ways. She noticed how she anticipated his visits, how her chest warmed when she saw him approaching on horseback. She found herself hesitating before speaking, careful not to reveal too much, not to let her feelings show. Fear was still there. The fear of trusting someone, of allowing herself to depend on another person after all the time she had been hurt. She reminded herself that she had come to the hills to live alone, to rely on no one but herself. Yet every time he offered help, every time he shared a quiet smile, that fear clashed with a longing she could not ignore. One particularly cold morning, she struggled to lift a heavy log for the stove. Her hands were numb, her fingers stiff from the frost, and her body was weary from days of work. He appeared without warning, watching her with quiet concern. "Let me help," he said, stepping forward. She shook her head, insisting she could manage, but he didn't argue. Instead, he simply moved closer, steadying the log with his strong hands. Together, they carried it inside, and she felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. She hated to admit that she needed help, yet she also couldn't deny how comforting it was to have someone beside her. The tension between independence and connection grew stronger over the following weeks. Some days, she found herself keeping him at arm's length, deliberately avoiding eye contact or brushing off small gestures. She told herself it was for her own protection, that she needed to remain self-reliant. But her heart betrayed her, and she noticed the moments she lingered on his presence longer than necessary, the small smile that escaped her when he handed her a tool, or the warmth she felt when he offered a simple compliment. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that the turning point arrived. She had been working alone on the roof, balancing carefully as she secured the last few boards. The wind picked up unexpectedly, whipping snow and dust across the land. A plank shifted beneath her foot, and she lost her balance, slipping dangerously close to the edge. Fear shot through her body, and she realized, with a jolt, that she could not hold on alone. He appeared in an instant, his horse thundering across the snow-covered field. He reached her just in time, steadying her and pulling her back to solid ground. Her heart raced, not from the cold or the near fall, but from the realization that she had let herself be saved. Relief, gratitude, and an unfamiliar vulnerability swept through her. She wanted to pull away, to insist she could do it herself, but the warmth of his hands and the steady reassurance in his eyes made her pause. That night, by the small fire in the cabin, she struggled to make sense of her emotions. She had fought so hard to remain independent, to avoid relying on anyone, and yet she found herself yearning for his presence. He sat nearby, quietly tending the fire, his calm demeanor offering a silent comfort. Finally she spoke, her voice tentative. I don't know how to do this. How to trust again." He looked at her, understanding in his eyes, and said nothing at first. Then, softly, he replied, "You don't have to figure it out all at once. I'm here, and I'll wait. No pressure, no rush." The honesty in his words struck her. It was the first time she realized that trust did not have to be forced. It could grow slowly, patiently, without fear of being rushed or judged. She felt a flicker of hope, but also a lingering fear. What if she allowed herself to care and then lost him? What if opening her heart meant facing pain she could not bear? She had learned through hard experience that love could bring joy, but it could also leave scars. In the following days, their interactions became more delicate. They worked side by side, their movements careful, their words measured. Every touch, every glance carried unspoken questions and tentative hope. She found herself noticing him more, the slight furrow of his brow when he concentrated, the gentle way he handled the tools, the quiet patience in his gestures. And yet she still held back, unsure how much of herself she could safely reveal. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the cabin that had been weakened by wind, she paused and looked at him. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted quietly, her hands gripping a hammer. He stopped, meeting her gaze with calm understanding. "Ready for what?" he asked gently. "For everything," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, as if he understood perfectly, and continued working beside her. No words of judgment, no pressure, only quiet support. The balance between fear and desire became the center of her days. She longed for connection, for the warmth of companionship, but she also feared losing the independence she had fought so hard to gain. Every small gesture from him, every moment of shared laughter or quiet conversation pulled her in deeper, while the memory of past pain warned her to stay cautious. It was an emotional tightrope, and she walked it with both hope and apprehension. One evening, a misunderstanding threatened to unravel the fragile trust they had built. She had been quiet for days, avoiding him more than usual, lost in her own thoughts. He approached her to offer help with some tasks, and she responded sharply, letting frustration color her words. He paused, hurt flickering across his features, and stepped back without arguing. For the first time, she saw the impact of her fear, how it could push away someone who truly cared. She realized then that protecting herself too rigidly might mean losing the possibility of connection entirely. That night she sat alone in the cabin, staring at the fire, reflecting on her actions. She understood that fear could not control her forever. She wanted trust, companionship, and perhaps even love, but it required courage. "I've seen this before, and now because it didn't open its head." It felt good to be in fresh night air again, while it didn't open its head. Now we were pleased. Within Daisy, now we word from its brothers, with wise and be kind brothers. I'm sorry, she said simply, meeting his eyes. I let my fear get the better of me. He smiled softly, relief and understanding in his expression. It's okay, he said. We all have fears. What matters is what we do with them. The weight of tension lifted slightly, and she realized that honesty, even in its simplest form, could heal wounds and strengthen bonds. As the cold deepened and snow covered the hills, their partnership grew stronger, more resilient. They worked together efficiently, shared stories by the fire, and found comfort in the quiet presence of one another. She learned that opening her heart did not mean losing herself. It meant allowing someone to walk beside her, not in control, but as a companion, a steady presence in a world that could feel harsh and unpredictable. The woman began to understand that love and fear could coexist, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. She realized that trusting the cowboy did not diminish her strength, it enhanced it. Together, they faced the harsh winter, the challenges of construction, and the uncertainty of their own emotions. Each day brought small victories, quiet moments of connection, and the realization that life could be richer when shared. By the end of winter's first month, the cabin was finally complete. Standing together looking at the warm, sturdy structure, she felt pride not only in what she had built, but in the trust she had allowed herself to give. The cowboy stood beside her, silent but present, and she understood that their journey had transformed them both. The cabin was no longer just a place to live. It was a symbol of resilience, patience, and the fragile, beautiful beginnings of love. She knew that challenges would still come, that fear might resurface, and that the road ahead would not always be easy. But she also knew that she no longer had to face it alone. The cowboy had offered his heart, patiently, without demand or expectation, and she had begun to open hers in return. Together, they had built more than a cabin. They had built trust, connection, and a foundation for the life they were slowly learning to share. Spring slowly returned to the hills, melting the snow and bringing life back to the frozen ground. The woman stood outside her cabin one morning, breathing deeply. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh grass, and the subtle sweetness of wild flowers beginning to bloom. She ran her fingers over the wooden frame of the cabin, now complete and sturdy, a place that had once been only a dream in her mind. Every board, every nail, every careful measurement reminded her of how far she had come. But as she looked around, she realized that the most important thing she had built was not just the cabin, it was herself. The cowboy rode up the narrow path, his horse crunching softly over the newly thawed ground. He stopped a few feet away, tipping his hat and offering a gentle smile. "Morning," he called, his voice warm and calm. She waved, a small smile returning to her lips. Over the months, he had become more than a helper, more than a neighbor. He had become a presence she could rely on, a steady part of her days. She knew now that her life could hold both independence and connection. Together, they began finishing the last touches of the cabin. She painted window frames, he fixed the door hinges, and side by side they swept away sawdust and debris from the interior. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops after trust has grown between two people. Occasionally, they would exchange a glance, a soft smile, or a quiet laugh at some small mistake. Every gesture, every shared moment, reinforced the bond that had been carefully forming through months of labor, patience, and quiet companionship. After the work was done for the day, they sat outside the cabin, sharing simple bread and warm tea. She looked at him, noticing the way his eyes softened in the light of the setting sun. She thought of the first day they had met, how she had been determined to do everything alone, how fear and pride had kept her walls so high. Now, sitting next to him, she realized that allowing someone into her life had not weakened her. It had made her stronger. "You've built more than a cabin," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "You've built a home, a place where life can happen, and you've built yourself." His words made her heart swell, and she felt a lump in her throat. She had spent years doubting her worth, doubting her strength, doubting whether she could ever trust again. And yet, here she was, standing beside someone who had quietly, patiently helped her believe in herself once more. They spent the next few weeks settling into the cabin. She discovered that life could be simple and full at the same time. Mornings were spent gathering firewood and tending to the small garden she had started. Afternoons were for working on small improvements to the cabin, building shelves, fixing furniture, or painting walls. Evenings were for sharing meals, talking about their days, or simply enjoying the quiet together. Each day was ordinary in its details, but extraordinary in the way it brought them closer. Over time, the woman found herself letting go of the lingering fear that had once held her back. She realized that trusting someone did not mean losing herself. It meant sharing life with another, letting both people grow stronger together. The cowboy had offered his heart patiently, without pressure, without demand, allowing her to choose when and how to accept it. And slowly she did. Not all at once, but piece by piece, in quiet moments of laughter, conversation, and shared work. One afternoon, as they repaired the small fence around the cabin, he paused and looked at her. "You know," he said gently, "this place isn't just yours anymore. It's ours, if you'll let it be." She looked at him, her heart racing, but instead of retreating, she stepped closer. "I want it to be," she whispered. The words felt simple, but they carried months of fear, hope, and slowly blooming love. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully imagine a life shared, a life that included someone else beside her, not as a burden, but as a partner. Winter had taught them lessons about patience, resilience, and the strength of working together. Spring now brought the reward of warmth, growth, and possibility. Together they planted small trees around the cabin, knowing that these living things would grow as they did, steadily, patiently, and with care. Each tree became a symbol of new beginnings, of trust, and of the life they were slowly shaping together. Evenings were their favorite. They would sit by the fire, the cabin warm and safe, and talk about dreams they had never shared before. She spoke of the life she had left behind, the lessons learned, and the hope she now carried for the future. He shared his memories of the land, of life before meeting her, and the quiet joy he had found in their shared work. Their conversations were never rushed, never forced. They flowed naturally, like the hills and streams surrounding them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with pink and orange hues, he took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. No words were needed. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a recognition that she had finally allowed herself to trust completely, to accept love without fear. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe, not just in her surroundings, but in her heart. Life in the hills continued, peaceful but full of small adventures. They explored nearby trails, collected wildflowers, and celebrated small victories together. The first harvest from the garden, the first snowfall, the first clear night under a sky filled with stars. Each experience, no matter how ordinary, became special because it was shared. She realized that happiness was not about grandeur or excitement. It was about connection, trust, and the quiet moments that built a life worth living. The cabin itself became more than just a home. It was a testament to their combined effort, to patience, and to perseverance. Every scratch on the wood, every nail hammered, every beam lifted, carried memories of struggle, triumph, and growing closeness. She often looked around and marveled at how a structure that had begun as a solitary dream had transformed into a shared sanctuary. Neighbors began to notice the change too. They saw her walking alongside the cowboy, working together on tasks, sharing smiles and laughter that had been absent before. Some commented quietly about how they seemed happy, though the woman barely noticed. Her focus was not on what others thought, but on the life she was building, one filled with trust, companionship, and a quiet, steady love that felt real and enduring. As spring turned into early summer, she realized something she had not expected. The fear that had once defined her life had faded. It had been replaced by courage, the courage to trust, the courage to love, and the courage to accept help without seeing it as weakness. She had learned that life's greatest strength was not in facing it alone, but in finding someone who respected her independence while walking beside her through every challenge. One evening, they watched the sunset from the cabin porch, the hills glowing in gold and green. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of his presence. He wrapped an arm around her gently, a silent promise that he would stay by her side. They didn't need words. The months of shared labor, patience, and quiet trust had spoken more than any conversation could. She felt a deep, peaceful certainty that they were beginning something lasting together. Their story, once filled with fear, loneliness, and the unknown, had transformed into a life of quiet joy and companionship. The cabin stood as a symbol not just of her determination, but of their shared journey. It was proof that even after hardship and heartbreak, people could rebuild, trust again, and discover love in unexpected places. She had come to the hills seeking solitude, but she had found something far richer: connection, trust, and a partner to share her life. The days continued in their simple, meaningful rhythm. They worked, rested, laughed, and shared dreams. Each moment, no matter how small, became part of the foundation they were building together, stronger than wood or nails, rooted in honesty, patience, and love. She knew that challenges would still come, that life was never completely without difficulty, but she also knew that together they could face anything. Standing outside the cabin one morning, looking over the hills, she felt a profound sense of gratitude.